Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. It's a new year, and I wanted to spend some time talking to the leaders of some of my favorite legal charities about what they did in 2022 and what they're looking forward to in the new year. Today's guest is the Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Joanna Background, and the CCF is the legal charity that I work for as well. And I am just so excited for this conversation about what we have achieved together in the past year and what to look forward to in the next. I am so passionate about the work we do at the CCF. We are involved in some of the most significant and novel constitutional cases in Canada. We've been involved in cases about property rights, security of person and patient choice, free expression, and of course, those COVID restrictions. So Joanna, thank you so much for joining me today. I am just thrilled to be having this conversation. Let's start off with a little bit about you and maybe how you got involved in the CCF and why you are so passionate about the topic of fundamental freedoms and Canada's Constitution.
Yeah, so like you, I'm a lawyer by training. I was a criminal defense lawyer for Eddie Greenspan quite briefly early in my career. And when he passed away, I had to refocus. And it was around that time that you actually posted on social media that you worked for a charity and you found it to be incredibly fulfilling. And I was coming off of an extremely fulfilling but very stressful job. And I was like, oh, that sounds really fun. And you actually said, I wake up and I'm excited about what I do and I'm so passionate about it. And, I work hard, but I work hard because I care so much. And in the post, you said there's another amazing charity that's hiring right now. And that turned out to be the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Its executive director was Marnie Supkoff, who was such an amazing mentor to me, such an amazing writer and thinker. And I had always been kind of on the outskirts, I would say, of the freedom movement and had been involved kind of as a side interest. But I had never looked at it as something that could be part of my career. But when I thought about everything that I'd worked towards and all of my interests and all of the various internships I'd done, and also just my values, it seemed like such a good fit. So I actually started as national director of the Runnymede Society, which I know that you've spoken to Chris Kinsinger, who now runs the organization and is doing such an amazing job, but it didn't exist at the time. And so Marnie just told me to go and start a legal, intellectual, freedom-based movement across Canada with chapters in law schools. So I did that for 3 years, yes, from early 2016 until spring of 2019. And then I became executive director of the CCF. And I've been doing this for the whole pandemic. And luckily, about a year into the job, I was able to convince you to come over and join me, which has made it even more fun.
Yeah, honestly, I did feel that way about the previous organization I worked for. I was very passionate about it. Canadian Taxpayers Federation, wonderful organization. I feel even more passionate, if it's possible, about the work that we do at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. So thanks for bringing me on. Yeah. And we're like a dynamic duo, so have so much fun every day and work on some of the most interesting cases that we have in Canada. But let's talk first about the goal of the CCF, the mission of our organization. How would you describe it? What would you say if someone said, give me your elevator pitch? What is the CCF? What are you about?
Yeah, well, what I say to people pretty much every day is that we fight to defend your rights. Like you specifically, if you're a Canadian person, like your specific rights, your ability to build a business, buy property, build a life, sort of like manifest your dreams, however you want to do that. Canada is a place which I think is the greatest country in the world, but unfortunately it's a place where increasingly government puts restrictions in place that make it very difficult to carry out these very basic human flourishing functions. And so we defend fundamental freedoms in courts of law and public opinion. So part of it is building awareness, writing. You have an amazing presence on YouTube. But part of, I would say, the most important part is that we actually take governments to task in court.
Yeah.
That is a very important way of holding power to account.
And some of those areas of law that we work in, freedom of expression, we have cases coming up on that topic all the time, property rights, how the charter applies and where it applies, religious freedom, just the full gambit of fundamental freedoms in Canada. And we've got to go to commercial break, so we can't dive into every single detail of every one of those cases right now. But in the next segment, we're going to. And I think I want to start with the issue of the Supreme Court and what our presence has been like at the Supreme Court in 2022, because it has been tremendous. We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm discussing the work of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, that's the organization that I work for, with our executive director, Joanna Background. Now, Joanna, one of the things that was so spectacular about the last year was the CCF's presence at the Supreme Court. We actually appeared at the Supreme Court 4 times in that year. We're scheduled to appear at least 3 times in the new year. So big presence for an organization as small as ours, with some incredible legal counsel representing us. Why don't you tell us about some of those cases we were involved in last year? Let's start with a case that was just argued about federalism, and a case from Quebec, and the question of whether or not a province can be forced to implement federal law.
Yeah, so that was an interesting case. It's a Ministry of Justice for the Attorney General for Canada versus Ministry of Attorney General for Quebec. And as you say, it was really, it concerned a specific Indigenous Child Services program that the federal government was asking Quebec to implement. But the issue that we took with it, and the issue in the case, didn't have to do with the program per se. It had to do with the fact that you had the federal executive directing, even you could say coercing, the provincial government to implement a program without any type of consultation. And just as this case was going to be argued, this became all of a sudden like a very relevant zeitgeisty case in the context of how we look at the division of powers. Because I didn't really understand this before, but it's a popular misconception that the federal government is somehow preeminent over provincial governments. That's not how the federation is designed to be set up at all. They are sort of co-equal and sovereign in their spheres of jurisdiction. And so the federal government can't say, well, we're the feds, we're Ottawa, so go do this. And as Danielle Smith and her Sovereignty Act brought that out, and we're not going to get into that because we're not involved in any litigation around that right now.
Yet.
Yet, it's coming. But I think the point is that, the federal executive can't just can't just deputize the provincial executive to do what it wants to do. It has to consult with it. It has to see it as an equal partner.
What stood out to me about that case, the federalism in Quebec case, was it's so interesting that Quebec is saying to the feds, we don't have to implement federal law. You can't you can't coerce us into implementing federal law. And that case got, I would say, very little attention. But when Alberta says the same thing, you can't force us to implement federal law, it is a huge thing. Now, there's constitutional issues with the Alberta Sovereignty Act as well, but there's a thread that runs through these issues where Quebec doesn't receive the same level of scrutiny, some might say, that Alberta does.
Maybe we're just used to it with Quebec.
Yeah, you lived in Quebec. You went to school there, so you're more familiar with the unique culture of that province. But let's move on to another case, one that's actually been decided by the court now that the CCF had a big influence in, and that's the Annapolis case from Nova Scotia, decided by the Supreme Court, that dealt with something called constructive taking. We've got a minute and a half or so. What can you tell us about that case and the CCF's impact?
So Annapolis owned a huge, valuable parcel of land in Halifax. The city decided to essentially promote that parcel of land, bring all this bureaucratic red tape so they couldn't develop it, promote the land as a public park while not acknowledging that they were effectively taking it, doing what in law is called a constructive taking. Previously, the law had been basically, you need an ownership right in order to get compensated in that circumstance.
Yeah, because governments can expropriate property, but they need to pay compensation. In this case, if you just take it and act like it's yours and sort of restrict the owner's ability to use it, they didn't pay compensation.
Yeah. So the good news is that we got an amazing result which clarified that no, there doesn't have to be a transfer of ownership right. If the government uses your land and gets an advantage from it, then they have to pay compensation. And it was a 5-4 decision. It was very close, but it was also clear that our submissions were pivotal, if that's not too immodest to say. It's a huge case, and it's huge for property rights in Canada, which
which are not constitutionally enshrined in Canada, but do have common law protections.
Yes.
Now, we've got about 30 seconds. We're heading to the Supreme Court a few times in 2023. What are those cases, just briefly? I know there's the Impact Assessment Act. What's that referred to as? The No More
So that's
Pipelines?
called the No More Pipelines Bill, and that essentially says that the government can't just use what's called the incidental effects doctrine, which is to say that if a federal area of jurisdiction spills over into the province, they can just use that to fully legislate, and we say that goes too far. They can't just go into provincial areas of jurisdiction and take over.
And there's also the question of, does the charter apply to Indigenous self-governments, which has never before been considered, and we're hoping to get leave in our case about patient choice in healthcare. Now, we've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm with Joanna Background, who's the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, same charity I work for. We're discussing the really fun, novel, and fascinating cases that we've been involved in the past year and what we'll be involved in next year. So we had a very busy year related to the Emergencies Act, which was invoked in February in response to the Freedom Convoy. First time it's ever been used. What can you tell me first about the public inquiry that just wrapped up at the end of last year that we participated in?
So we were granted standing to make submissions and to make cross-examinations to present our legal arguments, which was held this fall in Ottawa, the Rouleau Commission. And our submissions really focused on the question of whether the act was necessary as a means of last resort, which is clearly required by the statute. And I think our lawyer really brilliantly showed the panoply of legal remedies that were available to various levels of government, policing powers, and that it simply wasn't an act of last resort. Then, towards the end of the hearings, of course, we heard this very interesting legal argument from the federal government.
Interesting or wrong.
Right. Yeah. That even though the threshold of threats to the security of Canada per the CSIS Act was not met, it was met on their different set of inputs. Mm-hmm. And it's very explicit in the Emergencies Act that the definition of threats to the security of Canada is the same as in the CSIS Act. So it was kind of like having somebody tell you 2 + 2 = 5. Like it was like such a mass gaslighting. So we also very strenuously push back against that. It cannot be the case. Like there's so many statutes that rely on other statutes. So now we're going into, in March of this year, we're going into our federal court judicial review,
which is separate from the inquiry.
Separate. It's actually, we'll have an opportunity to make factual findings, to make factual submissions, but also it's like a formal legal judicial determination of whether the government properly invoked the act. So both are extremely important, and I would imagine that the federal court hearing will be influenced by the Public Order Emergency Commission, given that
that report will come out mid-February.
Yes.
So that'll be really fascinating to follow and see what happens. Now, one of the other things that we did a lot of work in over the last 2-3 years is COVID-related work. And it is my sincere hope that we're done with that. I don't want any more COVID work, but we do still have a few appeals from things that we started earlier on in the pandemic, specifically a challenge to the British Columbia vaccine passport system. And we're appealing the result of that. What can you tell me briefly about what happened in those cases?
Yeah, so the BC vaccine passport case I know was like heartbreaking for you when you got the result because you worked so hard on it. You worked so closely with the applicants who had just had such heartbreaking circumstances, a pregnant woman with brachial neuritis, a teenager who developed pericarditis. And essentially what the judge held was because these
people who were pro-vaccine,
right,
but couldn't get a second dose, and they were still excluded from life. So yes, you're right. I'm very passionate about it. So what happened in that case, though?
Yeah, so it was a very frustrating result in that the judge held that essentially the applicants had not extinguished all of the remedies. They hadn't gone all the way through with applying to public health, even though public health itself, on its own guidelines, explicitly, first of all, excluded the conditions of these applicants, and second of all, no physician would have provided a note for them because of College of Physician obligations. So they essentially said the rule on its face looks unfair, but because public health would have implemented it in a way and shown discretion, you don't get the remedy. And
yeah, it wasn't unconstitutional because public health wasn't following their own laws in secret.
Right.
I mean, what an outrageous result.
Yeah.
Now, there's also a case that we're hoping to be involved in related to math and race in Ontario. We've got about 45 seconds. What can you tell me about that case?
So a group of basically would-be Ontario teachers challenged the requirement. The Ontario legislature brought in a requirement to pass a pretty basic math test to be a teacher, a public school teacher in Ontario. And a lower court judge found that because there was some evidence that people in certain groups did more poorly on the math test than others, it was a discriminatory requirement. And this immediately rung alarm bells that, well, what about lawyers and doctors and nurses and all of these other professions that require a basic demonstration of competency? And furthermore, it just enshrined this very strong equality of outcome view. Obviously, the question of who's good at math and who's going to perform, math wasn't my strongest subject.
It's taking out equality of outcome to an extreme, and also it's kind of bigoted to say certain groups may not perform as well in math.
Right.
So we are pushing back. We want to push back on that one. We've got to go to break now, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the work of the Canadian Constitution Foundation with Joanna Background. Now, Joanna, we've talked about all of the fascinating litigation that we do at the CCF, but we do not just do litigation. We also have a big mandate to do public education. So what are some examples of the public education projects that we have? I know that there's actually a free course that we're offering on constitutional law. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so we put it out. It was released in March of 2022. It's free to anybody to sign up. It's theccf.ca/learn, and essentially 10 lectures from amazing professors, lawyers, little bit of material from you and I, and it's just on all of your fundamental freedoms. And they really are, they're about 20 to 30 minutes in length per topic, and they're very lively, and you will be an expert in what your fundamental freedoms are by the end, and you'll get a certificate from us. And
if you pass the quiz, there's a quiz at the end of each segment. It's not too challenging. If you watch the material, you'll be able to pass the quiz, but this is not just handing out a certificate. You actually need to put a little bit of work into this to earn the certificate from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Now, we also have had some book projects in the last year with some free resources available, like these ebooks that anyone can download from our website for free. What can you tell me about those ebook projects?
So last year we did a great one called Freedom Through Federalism, which was a collection of 10 essays about cases that matter, because our view is that our liberties are not just guaranteed through the Charter, but also through the division of powers, as we mentioned. You had a fun one that you prepared at the holidays called the 12 Days of
Public Order Emergency Commission.
Yes.
Holiday-themed Emergencies Act.
So if you're still in the holiday mood or you want to get in the Scrooge-type mood, you can go and download that. I'm sure we'll have more this year. We also are going to do a specialized mini course on freedom of expression, because you and I have a particular interest in that. So we'll have a series of lectures on the dimensions of free expression, why it's such an important foundational value of a free society, right? Because we have to be able to discuss ideas freely in order to arrive at the truth.
And one of the things that we've been working on over the past couple of months, which is a bit of a teaser because it's not ready yet, but we have been working on a book about COVID and civil liberties and the implications of the pandemic response, the government pandemic response on our freedoms, on our fundamental freedoms. Why is it so important to have a record like that? And what's been your experience been like going back over some of the stuff that happened during the pandemic?
It's so surreal. Like, you sent me a message in our WhatsApp chat the other day reminding me of the phenomenon when they roped off shelves in Walmart. And we say it's memory hold phenomenon, that we were all in such an altered state because none of these things have ever happened before. But to go back, knowing what we know now about the virus, about everything, about how it spreads, just how absurd it was that we had a situation where it's like, let's cram more people into the produce aisles and not allow them to go get dog food. So it's important to have a record that all of this happened, because there's no guarantee that it couldn't happen again.
Yeah, going back over some of the old articles about things that happened during the pandemic, it was so strange to see videos of police breaking up Christmas parties, to read accounts of families who were pulled over because they were out a few minutes past curfew in Quebec, or the Quebec government discussing potentially allowing warrantless searches of people's homes to make sure they weren't gathering. Or when the Ontario government suggested maybe we'll just randomly stop people on the street
Or
to see why they're out. Or what was your example?
2 years of no cherry blossoms.
Oh
at
my
Hyde Park.
gosh, when they roped off the cherry blossoms. When you think about this stuff, it really is a trip to go back and look at all this stuff and say, I can't believe that was the world we lived through.
Yeah.
So it's been a fun experience working on this book with you. And I'm looking forward to having it come out in 2023. We'll have a whole show when that's over or when that's done. Now, one last question. People are very passionate about the work we do. How do people support the CCF? We've got just 10 seconds. Where do they go?
We are entirely privately funded. We don't get any money from the government. theccf.ca/donate. You can also get on our email list, learn about what we're up to. You can donate to specific projects if you're interested in them.
Awesome. Joanna, thank you so much. We've heard today about the work of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the legal charity that I work for, that advocates for fundamental freedoms in the courts of law and public opinion. I am so proud of all the work that we did at the CCF in 2022, and I can't wait to see what 2023 brings. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.